In the spring of 1974, in Clark County, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Pruitt stood at the edge of her east field with a corn chisel in her hand and made a decision that every farmer within 5 miles of Osceola thought was either laziness, ignorance, or both. She left the stalks standing, not some of them, all of them. 43 acres of dead corn stalks from the previous fall's harvest, still rooted, still upright in places, bent and brown and rattling in the March wind. And Nora Pruitt walked back to the house, put the chisel in the shed. By the end of that week, the story had made it from her neighbor Dale Crofton's fence line to the Osceola Co-op, and from the co-op to the counter at Mel's Diner on Jefferson Street, and from the diner to the parking lot of the First Methodist Church on Sunday morning, where it arrived with the particular embellishment that small county stories collect when they travel. The version at the church was that Nora Pruitt had decided she didn't feel like farming anymore, that she'd given up, that the Pruitt place was going to go to weeds inside of 2 seasons, and somebody ought to say something to her before it did. Nobody said anything to her. They just talked about it where she wasn't. Let me tell you about Nora Pruitt, because what she did with those 43 acres only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to look at a field the way she looked at it. Nora was born in 1943 on the same 160 acres. Her father was Clarence Pruitt, who had farmed Clark County since 1931, which meant he had farmed it through the drought years, through the dust, through the period when the topsoil of southern Iowa turned into something that moved sideways in the wind and didn't come back. Clarence was not a man who talked much about what he'd seen in those years, but he was a man whose farming reflected it in every decision he made for the rest of his life. He did not burn the residue. He left the ground covered because he had watched uncovered ground leave, and he did not intend to watch it again. Clarence's workshop was in the low building behind the house, a poured concrete floor with a tin roof that drummed in the rain, a wood stove in the corner that he kept fed from November through April, and a workbench along the south wall that he had built in 1938, from oak salvaged out of a collapsed corn crib on the Yancey place. He had a soil probe he'd made himself from a length of pipe with the end filed to a bevel. He had a hand level and a set of infiltration rings he'd cut from a coffee can. He had a notebook, a composition book with a marbled cover, that he'd been filling since 1934 with observations about his fields, what the soil looked like after rain, how fast the water moved, where the runoff started. He didn't call it anything. It was just the notebook. He kept it on the workbench next to the coffee can rings, and when Nora was old enough to follow him to the field, she followed him to the field, and when she was old enough to read the notebook, she read the notebook. Clarence died in January of 1971. He left Nora the farm, paid for 160 acres in Clark County, with no mortgage and no liens, a savings account at the Osceola State Bank with $14,200 in it, the tools in the workshop, and the notebook on the workbench. He left her brothers the equipment, which was a different argument, and one that Nora settled by buying a used 1964 Oliver 1800 from a liquidation sale in Adair County for $800 cash. She was 28 years old. She had been farming the place alongside her father for 6 years by the time he died. She knew where the clay ran close to the surface on the West 40 and where the organic matter was deep on the creek bottom. She knew which draws collected cold air in late May and which slopes dried out first in June. She had read the notebook cover to cover 3 times, and she had started a second notebook of her own in 1969, Same marbled cover, same workbench. What Clarence had left her, beyond the land and the money and the tools, was a way of thinking about soil that the county did not share in 1971 and did not share in 1974 when she left the stocks standing. The county's thinking in those years was that a clean field was a good field, that tilling under the residue was management, that if you could see the bare dirt from the road in March, you were a serious farmer. Nora Pruitt's fields did not look like that. They had not looked like that since her father farmed them, and they did not look like that now. Now, the stocks. When Nora looked at those 43 acres in the spring of 1974, she did not see what everyone else saw. Here is what she saw. She saw a nitrogen source that had not finished decomposing. She saw a wind barrier that was still doing work. She saw root channels in the soil, the hollow tubes left by last year's root systems that were acting as conduits for water infiltration that no chisel pass could retaliate. She saw a ground cover that was keeping the March wind from moving the top half-inch of her soil to Dale Crofton's property. She had been watching her infiltration rings since 1969. She had been running the coffee can test her father had shown her, pouring a measured amount of water into the ring and timing how long it took to disappear. In 1969, the East 40 took 11 minutes. In 1973, after 4 years of leaving residue and reducing tillage, it took 4 minutes and 40 seconds. The soil was changing. She could measure it. That's why nobody understood what she was doing in 1974. They were seeing a woman who hadn't finished her spring work. They were actually watching the 5th year of a soil management program that had been running since 1969, based on her father's notebook and her own 5 years of infiltration measurements. And she had known since the previous October that she was going to leave the East 40 standing through the winter and into the spring because the residue load was the highest it had been since she started keeping records, and she did not want to interrupt what was happening in the ground. She had written it in the notebook on the 14th of October, 1973. East Field, 43 acres, leaves standing. Check infiltration, the 1st of June. Let me tell you about the work she did instead, because this is where Nora Pruitt proved that her father's thinking was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. While the county was running chisel plows through their fields in March and April of 1974, Nora was doing something different. She was planting, not into the east field, not yet, but into the creek bottom ground and the west 40, and she was planting into standing residue, which meant she needed her planter to cut through material that a standard planter could not reliably handle. She had known this since 1972. She had spent the winter of 1972 and 1973 in her father's workshop modifying the closing wheels on her 4-row planter, adding weight to the row cleaners, fabricating a set of residue manners from 3/16 plate steel she'd bought from the implement dealer. The dealer's name was Harold Biggs, and when she'd told him what she was cutting the plate for, he had looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has said something in a foreign language and then gone back to his invoice pad without further comment. The modifications had taken her 11 evenings in January and February of 1973. She had used her father's drill press, his angle grinder, and the set of tap and die tools he had acquired in 1952 from a machinist. The cutting oil was still in the reservoir on the drill press. She had run her first pass with the modified planter in May of 1973 into residue on the creek bottom, and the planter had cut through cleanly, placed the seed at the correct depth, and closed the furrow behind it. She had written that in the notebook too. May 9, 1973, creek bottom, modified planter, clean cut, good closure, emergence uniform, So, in the spring of 1974, while the county was plowing, Nora Pruitt was planting. Her planter could go into standing residue that would have plugged every other machine in Clark County. The East 40 she planted in late May, after the soil had warmed through the residue, and she ran the infiltration rings on the 1st of June as she had written she would. 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The best number she had ever recorded on that field. She wrote it in the notebook. The 1st of June, 1974, East Field 350. Best yet. The corn came up even. It came up in the residue, through the residue, and it grew in soil that had been covered all winter and all spring, soil that had not been moved by a chisel or a disc or a field cultivator, soil in which the root channels from the previous year were still intact, and the earthworm population, which Nora counted in the standard soil sample every spring, because her father had counted them, had increased for the 5th consecutive year. Dale Crofton came by in July. He drove his truck to the end of her lane and sat there for a while before he got out, which was his way of announcing himself without committing to the visit. He walked to the fence and looked at the east field for a long time without saying anything. The corn was knee-high and dark green, standing in rows that were slightly irregular because the residue had caused minor planter skip in 2 passes, which Nora had already noted and planned to address with further row cleaner adjustment. Dale Crofton did not appear to notice the irregular rows. He appeared to be looking at the color. He took his cap off. He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "That corn's dark," Nora said. "Yes, it is," he said. She said, "Same as last year. 120 pounds of nitrogen. No phosphorus, the soil test. Said I didn't need it." He looked at the field for another while. He said, "I put 140 on mine, and it's not that color." She didn't say anything to that. He put his cap back on and looked at her and said, "Your dad used to do something like this, didn't he?" she said. "Yes, he did." Dale Crofton nodded once, the way a man nods when he has received information he intends to think about privately. And he walked back to his truck and drove away. He did not say anything about the stalks she had left standing in the spring. He did not reference the conversation at the co-op. He just drove away, and the next time Nora saw him at the elevator in August, he asked her what infiltration rings were and whether she had a spare set she'd be willing to lend him. She lent him the set her father had made from the coffee can. She wrote it in the notebook. The 14th of August, 1974, lent Dale Crofton the infiltration rings. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone, and then watched that same community go quiet when the evidence arrived, stick with me, because this story doesn't end in 1974. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 14 years, because this is where the story stops being about a woman who left her cornstalk standing and starts being about something else entirely. Nora farmed the 160 acres through the late 1970 seconds. The way her father had farmed it, and the way she had been farming it since 1969, which is to say she reduced tillage every year. She kept earthworm counts in May, and she wrote everything in the notebook. By 1976, she had reduced her tillage passes from 4 to 2. By 1978, she had reduced them to 1. By 1980, she had fields she was planting directly into the previous year's residue with no tillage at all, which in Clark County in 1980 was not a management system. It was a rumor. She was also saving money, not dramatically, not in any way that called attention to itself. She was saving the way a person saves when their costs are genuinely low and their yields are holding and they have no debt and no payment aided. Her fuel costs dropped every year she reduced tillage. Her equipment hours dropped. Her repair bills dropped. In 1975, her total operating cost per acre was $47. In 1979, it was $51, which was an increase, but the county average had gone to $74 in the same period because input costs had risen and most operations had added equipment loans and expanded acreage. On-board costs had risen and moat the commoners. Nora had not expanded. She had not borrowed. She had farmed her 160 acres and put the difference in the bank. By 1981, she had $61,000 in the Osceola State Bank and a paid-for farm and a paid-for Oliver 1800 and a paid-for 4-row planter with modified row cleaners, and she had the infotoctration rings, both sets, because Dale Crofton had given the original set back to her in 1977 with a note that said he'd made his own. You know what happened in the early 1980 seconds? You know what happened to interest rates, and what happened to land values, and what happened to the farmers in Clark County who had borrowed money at 8% in 1976 to buy land at $2,400 an acre owed, and were now servicing that debt at 18%, while caution and wand. You know what that arithmetic produces. You know what it produces for a family that has done nothing wrong except believe that the conditions of the late 1970 seconds were permanent conditions and borrow accordingly. It produced a lot of auctions in Clark County between 1982 and 1986, and Nora Pruitt attended most of them, not with satisfaction. She was not a person who experienced her neighbors' losses with satisfaction, but with a quiet sadness that she had seen the mathematics coming for years and had not known how to say so without it. Sounding like something other than what it was, her expenses did not change. There was nothing to cut. She had no loan payments because she had no loans. She had no equipment debt because she owned her equipment. Her fuel costs were lower than any comparable operation in the county because she had been reducing tillage for 11 years and her tractor hours per acre were a fraction of what her neighbors were running. Her soil, after 11 years of residue management and reduced tillage, was holding moisture in dry years and shedding excess water in wet years with an efficiency that her infiltration numbers documented precisely. In the dry summer of 1983, when the county's corn yields dropped an average of 31 bushels per acre from the prior year, Nora's east field dropped 9 bushels. She wrote it in the notebook, county average est 89. She did not tell anyone that number. Dale Crofton figured it out at the elevator in September when he saw her load tickets and stood there doing arithmetic in his head with an expression that suggested the arithmetic was not coming out the way he expected. In the spring of 1984, the Hendrick place came up for auction. 80 acres, adjacent to Nora's north fence line, good ground on the creek bottom, and the slope above it, the Hendrick family having farmed it since 1922 and having lost it in the manner of many Clark County families in those years, which was not through any failure of farming, but through the particular cruelty. The opening bid was $640 an acre, which was where the bank had set the floor. Nora drove to that auction in the Oliver 1800s pickup, which was a 1969 Ford F-100 she had bought in 1975 for $1,200 and maintained herself, and she sat in the crowd and waited. There was a land company representative from Kansas City. There were 4 or 5 Clark County farmers who had survived the crisis with enough credit remaining to consider a purchase, though their faces suggested the consideration was painful. The bidding opened at $640. It moved to $700. It moved to $750. The Des Moines speculator dropped out at $790. The land company representative stayed to $820. The Clark County farmers Temers had dropped out one by one before $750. Nora bid $880. The land company representative looked at her for a moment and then looked at the auctioneer and did not raise his paddle. 80 acres, $880 an acre, $70,400 total. Nora Pruitt wrote a check from the Osceola State bank account that still had $11,000 left in it. After the check cleared, and she drove home and walked the fence line of the new ground, that after the soil, and thought about how long it would take to get the infiltration numbers. The crowd at that auction went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they have witnessed something that requires them to rearrange a set of assumptions they have held for a long time. Not applause, not comment. The particular silence of a group of people recalibrating simultaneously. Dale Crofton was standing near the back. He had not bid. He watched Nora write the check, and he watched her walk to her truck, and he stood there for a while after she drove away. Later that week, he drove to her lane and sat at the end of it for a while in his customary manner, and then got out and walked to where she was working on the planter in the yard, he said. "I didn't know you had that kind of money put away," she said. "I've been farming this ground for 13 years without a payment." He looked at the planter and then back at her, he said. "Your dad would have understood exactly what you just did." She said, "Yes, he would have." He nodded and drove away. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Clarence Pruitt would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora farmed the 240 acres, the original 160, and the Hendrick 80 through the late 1980 seconds. The drought of 1988 was the hardest summer Clark County had seen since the 1990 seconds. The county's corn yield that year averaged 74 bushels per acre. Nora's east field, the same 43 acres she had left standing in the spring of 1974, the field she had been building for 19 years with residue and reduced tillage and her father's infiltration rings and her own notebooks, yielded 109 bushels per acre. She wrote it in the notebook, 1988, East Field. 109 Bu, Ochre County and Gate, Est. 74. She did not tell anyone that number either. The elevator told it for her when her load tickets came through, and by October of 1988, the story had made the same circuit it had made in 1974, from the elevator to the co-op to the diner. This time, the farmers telling it were not laughing. They were telling it the way farmers tell a story when they have seen something with their own eyes that they cannot explain through the assumptions they currently hold, and they are trying to decide whether to change the assumptions. Harold Biggs, at the implement dealer, called her in November of 1988. He said he had been getting questions about no-till planters and residue managers, and he wanted to know if she would be willing to talk to some of the county farmers about what she was doing. She said she would. She stood up at the Clark County Extension meeting in January of 1989. In the basement of the Osceola Community Center, 43 farmers in folding chairs, and she put her note-book on the table. And she talked for 35 minutes. She talked about infiltration rates and organic matter and root channels and earthworm counts and fuel costs and tillage passes and the specific yield numbers from 1983 and 1988. She did not editorialize. She read from the notebook, and she showed the numbers, and she let the numbers say what she would not say herself. At the end, she said this. She said, "My father watched the topsoil of this county blow away in the 1,930 seconds. Because the ground was bare, I have been keeping it covered since 1969. That is 20 years of data in this notebook. The drought of 1988 did not treat my ground the same way it treated yours. That is not luck. That is the difference between soil that has been fed and soil that has been mined." The room was quiet for a moment, then Dale Crofton, who was sitting in the third row, said, "She's right. I've watched her ground for 15 years. She's right." Nobody laughed. Her niece, Lorraine, was 14 years old in 1989, the daughter of Nora's brother Gerald, and she had been coming to the farm on weekends since she was 9. She had her own notebook, same marbled cover, same workbench, and she had been running her own earthworm counts since 1987 and recording them with the same precision her grandfather had used in 1934. In the summer of 1989, Nora let her run the East Fields infiltration test alone. Lorraine came back to the workshop and wrote the number in her notebook, and then looked up and said, Nora said, "He didn't know. He watched the ground leave and he decided he was going to understand why. And then he spent the rest of his life understanding it." Lorraine wrote that in the notebook, too. The concrete floor Clarence poured in 1938 has one crack in it along the east wall that Nora filled with hydraulic cement in 1977. The wood stove is the same stove, the workbench is the same oak from the Yancey corn crib. The drill press, the angle grinder, the tap and die set from the Des Moines machinist, the infiltration rings in both sets, the coffee can original, and the ones Dale Crofton made and returned. All of it is still there. Lorraine Pruitt farms the 240 acres now. She has reduced tillage on every field to 0. Her infiltration numbers on the East 40, the field Nora left standing in the spring of 1974, are under 2 minutes. The earthworm count is the highest in the recorded history of that field, which goes back to 1934. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a field full of dead cornstalks in the spring? Most people see a farmer who hasn't finished her work. They see disorder. They see a field that should have been cleaned up in the fall. A woman who either doesn't know what she's doing or doesn't care. Nora Pruitt saw 19 years of her father's thinking made visible. She saw nitrogen that hadn't finished its work. She saw a wind barrier, a moisture trap, a network of root channels conducting water into the ground at a rate no chisel could produce. She saw the difference between soil that had been covered for a decade and soil that had been left bare every winter since the homestead. She saw the number on the infiltration ring, and she saw the earthworm count, and she saw the yield ticket from 1983, and she saw what was coming in 1988, not because she predicted the drought, but because she had built the only kind of ground that could survive it. A composition notebook and a coffee can cut into rings. 20 years of March mornings in a field that the county thought she'd abandoned. The 43 acres nobody thought she was managing, in the hands of the woman nobody understood until the drought came and her soil held. That is what her father left her, and she left it to Lorraine. And Lorraine is leaving it to the ground.